This program is a production of MASO, the Manx Association of Scientists, Artists and Writers. The sound of an antique Kirkman harpsichord. During the period in which I was permanently living in the Isle of Man, I was continually aware of the lack in variety of live music one could go and hear. The result of this was that despite of the interest in music developed in me at school, I was unable to increase my knowledge and appreciation of the subject by live performance. Now I'm sure that there must have been a harpsichord or two in the Isle of Man during the 1950s. I didn't have the pleasure of hearing one, however, and therefore it was with great interest I learnt that Alan Cuckston, a musician of some international repute, is visiting the island and giving a performance on the harpsichord at the Air and Arts Centre on the 23rd of April this year, and probably one or two performances during that week as well in other parts of the island. Recalling my lack of knowledge, I thought that a chat with Alan might encourage some of our listeners, who might not normally have considered going to the performance, to do so. Now, first of all, we had to find Alan, and his address has a superb ring to it. Swinsty Hall Manor, Blubberhouses, Yorkshire. Blubberhouses, as an inspection of the map informed us, is on the hills outside Otley near Leeds, in very picturesque countryside near the famous Ilkley Moor. The name Blubberhouses does not come from the whaling or fishing business, as at sea, but from a whaling of another kind. In fact, there used to be an orphanage in the area, and the blubbering of the unfortunate children echoing over the moors and hills has given the area its name. Swinsty Hall is a 16-roomed Elizabethan house, and it stands in a catchment area off a reservoir, and in fact is a superb house and has everything in it that you would expect of an Elizabethan house of that age and that design. Alan's music room is equally impressive, and it's full of equipment, about 20 feet by 30 feet, with a huge drape along one wall, and antique iron candelabra and chandeliers converted to electric. There's a high wooden gallery and high wooden panelling right round the room. And right in the middle of the room one finds a variety of instruments, harpsichords, pianos, an organ, and an unusual instrument which is half guitar and half lute. And with all these instruments in front of me, I started our conversation by asking Alan, indeed, how many instruments, harpsichords included, did he have in the house?
I think the first one I acquired was the copy of a French harpsichord of about 1750. Now that was actually made only 4 years ago by a Derbyshire maker called John Rooks. And I've also got another harpsichord which is a very old one. It's a Kirkman of 1785. Kirkman was an English maker, and the instrument was made in London. Then there are two grand pianos of 1798 and 1828, and those are both by the firm of John Broadwood, also a London maker. And lastly there's the little chamber organ, which was made by James Davis in 1790 for the London music firm of Longman and Broderick. The fascinating thing is that Kirkman, who was perhaps the leading builder of harpsichords in the 18th century in London, produced, say, about 25 instruments a year. And the incredible thing about John Broadwood is that he took advantage of all the innovations of the Industrial Revolution, and by 1800 he'd produced, about 1,400 grand pianos and some 3,000 or 4,000 square pianos, and he'd only set up business in about 1783. So that is an astonishing achievement, and by 1828, which is the date of the latest, the most recent instrument in the room, he'd produced 26,000 pianos in a period of about 40 years.
Quite a number. It's not everyone who has the room to put the instruments in like this, but I gather you have a particular reason for collecting them. Your normal work or your normal vocation, is it musical, or do you treat this as a hobby?
Oh, very much. It's my vocation, and I go all over playing harpsichord recitals and early piano recitals. I've just recently returned from a tour of North America. I was in Canada and the States giving recitals and lectures in universities and master classes on harpsichords. And I spend a great deal of my time playing these instruments and learning about the music that was written for them and how they used to play them in the 18th century and before then. And I do a number of lecture recitals as well, talking about the music and the repertoire and the general history of instruments. And of course one is constantly searching round for instruments which have survived from the early period. For instance, this Broadwood of 1798, this piano here, I found lying on its side in a barn in an old farmhouse in North Yorkshire some 3 years ago, and it was in a horrifying state. But as you see, I've had it restored to almost pristine condition.
there's the first piano in your collection. Quite a different sound to a modern piano.
Yes, it's very different. Of course, these early piano builders were working from the sound of the harpsichord. This was, of course, the instrument that they knew, and the reason why the piano developed, I suppose, was because music at that time was changing very much from the Baroque style of, say, Handel and Bach to the classical style of Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven. And consequently, keyboard players needed a new sort of instrument which was capable of a gradation between soft and loud, hence the name pianoforte, which they gave to this new instrument. Whereas on the harpsichord, the dynamic range, the volume that was available, was in a way limited in that you could only change from loud to soft and back again, and there was not the possibility of swelling from one to the other as you can achieve on a piano.
Now, if we can interrupt at that point, may I ask you what you're going to play for us and what on?
Yes, I'm going to play the Gigue from the fifth French suite of Bach on this fine double manual Kirkman Harpsichord of 1785.
I noticed looking at the different harpsichords you have in this room that they are slightly different in their structure and design. Is this from the area from which they came, or is it that there are different types of harpsichords as well?
Not quite that. The French harpsichord is from the period when the harpsichord reigned supreme, and to change the registration on that instrument there are hand stops. Now, this Kirkman harpsichord, as I've said, dates from 1785, and it therefore comes from the period when already it was an old-fashioned type of instrument, and the newfangled forte piano, or pianoforte, was taking over. And harpsichord makers were getting very anxious about this, and they tried all sorts of methods of competing with the piano. And one of the things they did was to introduce pedal registrations so that the players were enabled to alter the registrations very quickly to to give the impression of a rapid shift between the dynamics of soft and loud. And on this Kirkman harpsichord, one of the pedals operates the lid so that it raises and closes the lid to give the effect of a crescendo and a diminuendo. Precisely the effect, in fact, that the composers of this classical period were asking for in their piano music. But of course these were all awkward mechanical devices which were added to the harpsichord, and really the piano triumphed in the end because the piano was capable of performing all these functions quite naturally because these functions are part of its actual construction.
Now the harpsichord, the French harpsichord as you termed it before, I gather that's a fairly recent structure, however.
It is, yes. It was made 4 years ago, and it's an authentic copy of a mid-18th century French instrument. It's made by this builder John Rooks, who's working in Derbyshire. He is, as it were, a one-man business, and he spends his time copying old harpsichords, producing authentic replicas of French and Italian and Flemish designs from the classical period of harpsichord construction.
Well, he makes them now, but is there a market for this sort of thing, or is it extremely restricted?
Oh no, there's a tremendous interest in early keyboard instruments, even to such an extent that you can today go into a shop and order in kit form any one of those types of harpsichord I've mentioned. If you are a do-it-yourself person, and you can use fairly basic tools and know how to glue and so on, you can just take these pieces designed by I think basically American manufacturers, and you get all the parts, and with perhaps 600 or 700 hours of work you can make up one of these kits into a pretty good instrument.
Well, may we now hear some music on your new 4-year-old harpsichord?
Yes, I'd like to play you the Harmonious Blacksmith variations by Handel. This is a piece taken from the 5th suite of harpsichord pieces, which Handel published in the year 1720. And the reason for this title is that Handel apparently was walking one day in the forest of Edgware and heard in the distance the sound of this man singing, and it turned out to be a blacksmith working away at his anvil, and Handel was so taken by this tune that he recalled it sometime later and wrote this marvelous set of variations upon it.
That's a fairly modern instrument, but you're playing reasonably old music on it. Is music written for the harpsichord in the 20th century?
Yes, there's been quite a lot written. In fact, one article I was reading recently tells us that in the 20th century there have been over 2,000 works composed for the harpsichord. The trouble is that most of them are by composers who don't really understand the true nature of the instrument. But some of the most successful pieces have gone into the repertory. I'm thinking, say, of the two concertos for harpsichord and other instruments by the Spaniard Manuel de Falla and the Frenchman Francis Poulenc. And of course the harpsichord, because it is such a distinctive and individual sound, has been taken up by pop groups and light music arrangers and incorporated as an alternative, new and interesting sound into music in a lighter style.
We've been talking about fairly recently built instruments and modern music, but of course this needs people to play them. Do children graduate from a piano onto a harpsichord, or is there any youthful interest at all, or is it an interest which somebody develops after they've learned to play a piano?
I think on the whole people tend to start off with the usual piano lessons as children, and then, as I did, they would come to the harpsichord later on when they've acquired a sound technique in keyboard performance. But I imagine that as time goes on and more harpsichords become available, then perhaps children will start off at a much earlier age on the earlier type of keyboard instrument. For instance, I have 3 small daughters, the eldest is 7, and I hope that pretty soon they will be coming to the harpsichord quite seriously and taking it in their stride along with their normal piano lessons.
Is the harpsichord any more difficult to learn to play, or in fact to play once you've learned, than a piano?
Well, in a way, the harpsichord is more akin to organ in that one has to sustain the notes on the instrument by one's fingers alone, whereas piano technique allows one to use a sustaining pedal, and the music written for piano, if it's from the Romantic or modern period, does allow one a certain latitude in that it's quite possible for a bad pianist to get away with murder, as it were, whereas anyone who comes to the harpsichord must have a very clean and thorough technique, because anything you do, any note you touch, any smudge you make shows up instantly. So, in a sense, it requires a greater degree of exactitude and technical perfection than the piano. I'd like to illustrate what I mean by playing one of the most virtuoso pieces of harpsichord writing. This is a work by an English composer of the Elizabethan period who has the marvellous name John Bull, and the work is called The King's Hunt. And of course it's a piece of musical tone painting. It's descriptive of hunting horns and galloping horses and the chase and excitement, and it's full of rapid scale passages and horn calls. And indeed, John Bull has become known as the Liszt of the harpsichord. Franz Liszt, of course, was an outstanding virtuoso pianist of the 19th century, and his work for the piano is regarded as being fiendishly difficult. John Bull, therefore, acquires this kind of image as a composer of very difficult harpsichord music.
brings a picture to my mind of something very fragile. Is a harpsichord a delicate instrument, or is it as robust as a piano, especially when you have children in the house, for instance?
Well, certainly the amount of sound which can be produced by, say, a concert Steinway grand will cut through and dominate a full orchestra, as you know, and certainly one cannot expect this of the harpsichord. But the construction of harpsichords is certainly very strong and robust, even though, say, the sides of the case are so thin by comparison with a modern grand piano. But the instruments are marvelously resonant. The cases vibrate with the sound that's produced through them. And the whole beauty of a harpsichord is that everything there contributes to the ultimate sound which comes from the instrument. Whereas the sound basically on a modern piano comes only from the strings as they're hit by the hammers. Admittedly, the tension of the strings on a modern grand piano is enormous, and therefore the instruments have to be built like battleships. But even so, the construction of harpsichords is very strong. They are put together very firmly with great woodworking art, and certainly they stand up, for instance, to a great deal of transportation. I take mine all around the country and in aeroplanes and so on. And it's wonderful how they survive all this transporting about.
How do you find audiences react to harpsichords? By that I mean, do you find the people who come to your recitals tend to be people who are already converted, or do you get people who come along to find out, in fact, what a harpsichord is all about at times?
Well, of course, one gets the sophisticated listener who knows all about the instrument, all about its repertoire, and comes to hear what the artist does to the music that he or she probably knows already. But there again, one gets quite often people who come along inquisitively and wonder what it's all about, and one hopes that they will go away, as it were, converted. And very often I find young people are astounded by the similarity of the sound to the guitar. As you know, there's a tremendous interest in the classical guitar today, and I like to include quite a lot of Spanish music in my programs. I play a lot of Scarlatti and Soler, because this sort of music, which is very rhythmical and vital and exciting, and has this Spanish tinge to it, appeals a great deal to people who know that sort of area of classical music.
Is music that's been written for another instrument easily transposed onto a harpsichord?
Certainly not, no. Whereas on the piano, because of its sustaining pedal, you can perform almost anything from the orchestral repertoire. For instance, you can play transcriptions of Beethoven symphonies or Debussy orchestral piece on the harpsichord, because the sustaining of the notes is done by the fingers alone, and you don't have any mechanical sustaining aid. You can only play this kind of contrapuntal music, which has several strands of melody going on simultaneously, or very rhythmical, punctuated dance music. And the specific harpsichord repertoire, stretching from, say, the time of King Henry VIII through to the middle of the 18th century, and then the various modern works which happen to fit successfully on the instrument. This is really the repertoire that one is, well, I wouldn't say limited to, but this is the repertoire that you have for the harpsichord, and it's not possible really to perform the music for other instruments, except if one takes into account the organ, because the early organ music doesn't require the use of a pedal board, and often the music is interchangeable. In fact, composers often advertise their music as being for the harpsichord or the organ. And in the late 18th century, musicians who, as you know very well, are very commercially minded, advertised their music as being for the harpsichord, piano, or organ, so that they could cash in on all the possible markets.
Well, that brings us very nicely to the next instrument in your room here, which is an organ over there in the corner. Perhaps you could tell us a little about that.
Yes, now this instrument was made probably by a London organ builder called James Davis, and he supplied little organs to a firm of music publishers and instrument sellers in London called Longman and Broderick. And we can date it at around 1790. It's got just a single keyboard and a handful of stops, and it's typical of the sort of instrument which was used in England from a very early period. You can find little organs, little house organs of this kind, going right back to the 16th century. And they were used for the performance of keyboard music of various kinds, and also to play with stringed instruments like the viols, which were used in the 16th and 17th centuries. The harpsichord and piano, too, have always consorted with other sorts of instruments in chamber music, and the organ was felt to be particularly suited to playing in consort with stringed instruments. However, I'm going to let you hear it as a solo instrument, and first of all I'd like to play for you the well-known Prince of Denmark's March by Jeremiah Clarke. This you perhaps will know best by its more modern title, which is quite unauthentic, the Trumpet Voluntary.
The final piano in your collection here is coming a little more up to date.
That's right. It's another grand by this marvellous firm of John Broadwood, and it dates from 1828. Now, this was the time when the piano was acquiring its more modern sound, In fact, you can say that by 1830, really, the piano had acquired most of the characteristics that we know today in the modern instrument. For instance, it has a metal hitch plate, the beginnings of an iron frame. But it is still a classical instrument because its hammers are covered with leather, and it has a true left shifting unicorda pedal, which enables the player to play on either two strings or one string, as well as the three strings, so that you can get quite a lovely variety of sounds from this instrument, which are not possible on a modern grand piano. It has an extended range as well. It's got 6 1/4 octaves, and very shortly after this, the piano builders of the time were to create instruments with iron frames and with a 7-octave range, leading, as I say, to the modern conception of piano tone. And cashing in, as it were, on the recent vogue for ragtime music, I'd like to play you on this instrument of 1828 a piano rag from the Edwardian period by Scott Joplin, and it's called the Gladiolus Rag.